Rhys Callahan came back to his penthouse 4 days early, without telling a soul. He'd cut the Moscow trip short. Something about the meeting didn't sit right. Something in the way the Russians smiled a little too long after sliding a document across the table. When the private elevator opened into the living room of his 3-story Seaport District tower, he heard a woman's voice. She was speaking Russian, on his landline, in his home. Rhys had been running the Callahan organization for 17 years, since the night his father took a bullet in a family restaurant, while 19-year-old Rhys watched the light leave his eyes. In his world, Russian on his private line meant one of two things: an ally or a threat. He reached for the gun under his jacket. The woman turned. She was wearing a cleaning uniform, hair pinned tight, a mop bucket 3 feet behind her. She looked at the weapon, didn't flinch, raised one finger. "One moment, please," and kept talking. Rhys Callahan, the man who'd turned a street crew into a $100 million empire of hotels, casinos, and shipping routes, stood frozen in his own living room while the substitute housekeeper told him to wait. Her name was Elara Voss. She was 27. She'd grown up in the foster care system of South Boston, 6 homes in 7 years, one of which left a scar on her left wrist she never talked about. Her mother, an Eastern European immigrant, died of cancer when Elara was 11, in a public hospital with no insurance and no hope. The last thing her mother ever said was a sentence in Russian that Elara couldn't understand. She spent 3 years teaching herself the language from free apps and library books, just to translate that one sentence from memory. When she finally did, it said, "Don't be scared. I'm here." She sat on her kitchen floor and cried for the first time in 8 years. Then she didn't cry again. She learned a second language instead, then a third, then 11. No school, no tutor, no money, just a phone, earbuds, and the kind of quiet stubbornness that didn't need anyone's permission. She cleaned apartments, offices, hotel rooms. She showed up on time, worked without complaint, and left every space better than she found it. No one ever asked what she was listening to in those earbuds. It wasn't music. What she knew, what she'd heard on that phone call, and what she'd soon find buried inside 48 pages of Russian legal text, would either save everything Rhys Callahan had built in 17 years, or get them both killed. If this story satisfies you, hit that like button. It helps more than you think. Share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. You don't want to miss what's coming next. Now, let's go back to the moment Rhys Callahan was standing in his own living room, gun drawn, staring at a cleaning lady who'd just told a Mafia boss to wait. Elara spoke 2 more sentences in Russian, then ended the call with a formal farewell, the kind of farewell people only use with someone who stands far above them in rank. She set the phone down on the table gently, as if it weren't the thing that had just made a Mafia boss draw a gun in his own living room. Then she tore a sheet from the small notebook she carried in the pocket of her work uniform and slid it across the table toward Rhys. He didn't look at the paper right away. He looked at her. 17 years in the business had taught him to read people before he read words, and what he saw on her face wasn't fear, wasn't confusion, and wasn't the manufactured calm of someone trying to hide something. It was the complete emptiness of unnecessary emotion, the face of someone who had grown used to being dropped into situations nobody had prepared for, and had learned not to waste energy on reaction. Rhys put the gun back into the holster beneath his suit jacket, not because he trusted her, but because she wasn't afraid. And in the world he lived in, people who weren't afraid of a gun were either dangerous or they had already endured something worse than the mouth of a gun. He picked up the paper. The handwriting was small, neat, and clear. First line, Dmitry Volkov. Second line, an international phone number. Third line, response deadline, Friday. Final line, written in English. He states that the current document does not match the terms discussed in March. Rhys read that last line twice. The name Dmitry Volkov was one he knew more clearly than his own. 12 years of partnership, hundreds of millions of dollars moving between Boston and Moscow. And this line, the line the cleaning girl had just answered, was an encrypted hard line whose number only 5 people in the world knew. Dmitry calling this number meant he had called Rhys's mobile first, and no one had answered. It meant the matter was important enough to use the emergency number. He looked up. What did he say? His voice wasn't a question. It was closer to a command. Elara repeated the entire content of the call in English. Every sentence, every point, with nothing added and nothing omitted. Mr. Volkov wanted to confirm that the documents had been delivered and that Mr. Callahan had reviewed them. The corporation was waiting for a response before Friday. If there was no response, they would proceed based on what they had received. And at the end of the call, he added the sentence I wrote on the last line. When she finished speaking, she fell silent, offering no further explanation, asking nothing back, showing no sign that she wanted to know why a Russian call on an encrypted line had made the owner of the house pull a gun. He asked who she was. Elara Voss, temporary replacement employee from All Clean Services, assigned under contract during the housekeeper's surgical leave. Her voice was as flat as if she were reading from a personnel file. Rhys looked at her, then at the paper, then at the phone on the table. The content of the call matched exactly the thing that had made him cut his Moscow trip short by 4 days. In a conference room in Moscow the week before, the Russian side had placed a thick document in Russian in front of him, a document he didn't recognize, with something that looked like his signature on the last page, and it had been treated as a finalized agreement. The hired interpreter translated in a rush, skimming over the most important parts with the kind of summary any experienced man would recognize as a way of hiding details. The meeting ended in an atmosphere so polite it felt cold. Rhys photographed the entire document on his phone before leaving the room. On the flight back, Garrett called. His voice was as calm as ever. Just a small misunderstanding. I'm handling it. Don't worry. 17 years earlier, those words would have been enough. Now they weren't. Rhys folded Elara's paper and slipped it into the inner pocket of his suit jacket, right beside the gun. He didn't say another word. He turned away, walked through the hallway, went up the stairs, entered the study on the 2nd floor, and shut the door. Downstairs, Elara stood alone in the living room. She looked at the place where he had just been standing for 2 seconds, then turned back to the mop bucket, knelt on the marble floor, and went on with her work as if nothing had happened. Because for her, this wasn't the first time she had stood inside a room where the air felt heavier than every object in it. Rhys shut the study door and didn't come out for the next 7 hours. The room on the 2nd floor of the penthouse had bookshelves covering 3 walls, an oak desk so heavy it had needed a crane to lift it through the window when he moved in, and a leather chair in which he had sat through more life-changing decisions than he could count. But that night, the chair didn't help at all. He opened his phone, zoomed in on the photograph of the first page of the document, and began to read. 48 pages in Russian. Small, dense print, the kind of type used in legal documents that even native speakers had to read slowly. He opened Google Translate, photographed each page, and waited for the machine to process them. The results came back like someone had torn apart a dictionary and pasted the pieces randomly onto paper. The same phrase on page 3 was translated as financial obligation, but by page 7, it had turned into operational responsibility. A long sentence on page 12 was skipped entirely, the machine jumping from the line above to the line below, as if the whole sentence didn't exist. The most important sections, the exact sections his 17 years of instinct in the business told him to read carefully, were precisely the sections where the technology gave up. He scrolled through every page, making notes in the margins with his finger on the screen, marking the passages where the automatic translation was clearly wrong, even though he didn't know in what way it was wrong. At 11 that night, his phone vibrated. A message from Garrett Flynn. He opened it. 4 lines. Spoke directly with the Russian office. They confirmed everything was handled properly. There's no problem. Get some rest. We'll talk tomorrow. Rhys stared at the message for 10 seconds without blinking. He had known Garrett for 22 years. For 22 years he had read messages from this man without ever needing to read them twice. But tonight, the 4 lines on the screen sounded like someone trying to cover a window standing wide open with his bare hand. The wind was still slipping through the gaps between the fingers. He didn't reply. He placed the phone face down on the desk, leaned back in the chair, and closed his eyes. Not to sleep, to think. In 17 years of running the Callahan organization, he had never once been in a situation where the greatest threat lay inside a document he couldn't read. He was used to guns, to knives, to calls at 3 a.m. telling him someone had done something they never should have done. He knew how to handle those things. But 48 pages of Russian were different. They sat there on the screen in silence, and he knew they were saying something that could destroy everything he had, but he couldn't hear it. Close to 2 a.m, he got to his feet and stepped into the hallway. The penthouse was quiet. The city lights fell through the glass on the 2nd floor, drawing long streaks across the wooden floor. He heard a soft sound downstairs. Not a troubling sound, a familiar one. The sound of cloth brushing against wood, of water running lightly, of someone finishing the last task of the day without needing to be told. He went down the stairs, crossed the living room, and entered the kitchen. Elara was standing beside the sink, drying her hands with a clean towel. She turned when she heard his footsteps, not startled, not rushing, just turning with the reflex of someone who always knew exactly where she was in a space. Rhys stood in the kitchen doorway. The light above the granite island rose from below and cast upward shadows across his face. He was silent for a moment. She didn't ask anything, didn't fill the silence with unnecessary words, only stood there with the towel folded neatly in her hands, waiting. "Can you read technical Russian?" His voice was lower than usual, not by intention, but because it was 2 a.m. and 7 hours of reading something he didn't understand had worn his voice thin. Not conversation, legal documents, contracts. Elara didn't answer at once. 2 seconds. Long enough for Rhys to realize that she was truly weighing her answer, not searching for the best-sounding thing to say. "Depends on the document. But yes, 6 words. No showing off. No overpromising. No asking why or what for." Rhys gave a single nod. He turned, walked back up the stairs, went into the study, and closed the door for the second time that night. He lay down on the sofa in the room, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. He couldn't sleep. He stayed that way until 4 a.m, listening as the city outside slowly shifted from silence to the first sounds of a new day, and knowing that when the sun came up, he would have to place 17 years of his career in the hands of a cleaning girl whose name he hadn't even known 24 hours earlier. The first light of morning poured through the glass wall on the first floor when Rhys came down into the kitchen. He hadn't changed clothes since yesterday. His eyes were red, the shadows beneath them deep and bruised. The face of a man who had spent 4 hours lying on a sofa without managing to close his eyes for even a minute. The cup of coffee he had made for himself at 5 o'clock that morning had already gone cold on the granite island, with no more than 2 sips missing from it. On the kitchen table, the 48 pages of documents were stacked in a neat pile. He had transferred every photograph from his phone to his laptop, adjusted the brightness on each page until the words were clear, then printed them out on the printer in the study. It had taken nearly an hour, but at least now they existed on real paper, no longer as blurred photographs on a small screen that had forced him to zoom in and out all night like a man trying to see through the crack of a closing door. Elara came into the kitchen at 7:30, clean uniform, hair twisted into a tight bun, small backpack placed by the shoe cabinet near the side door as always. She saw him sitting there, saw the stack of papers, saw the cold coffee, and didn't ask a single question. She opened the cabinet, took out the cleaning supplies for the morning, and started in the dining room as usual. Rhys let her pass. Then he called out, not loudly, only enough for her to hear. She turned back. He pushed the stack of papers across the table toward her. "Read this and tell me what it says." It wasn't the voice of a man asking for help. It wasn't the voice of a man giving an order. It was the voice of someone who had run out of every other option and knew it. Elara looked at the stack of papers, then at him. 1 second. Then she set the cleaning supplies down on the floor, pulled out the chair across from him, sat down, and drew the stack toward herself. She didn't ask why. She didn't ask what it was. She showed no surprise that the owner of the penthouse had just asked the temporary cleaning girl to read 48 pages of Russian documents at 7:30 in the morning. She simply began. The way she read caught Rhys's attention at once. She didn't dive into page 1 and read straight down the way an ordinary person would. She flipped quickly through all 48 pages first, from beginning to end, pausing on each page for about 2 seconds, long enough for her eyes to scan the structure, but not long enough to read the content. Like an architect looking at the whole blueprint before studying the details of each room. When she reached the last page, she went back to page 1, took a pencil from the pocket of her uniform, and began to read for real, slowly, carefully. Every time she came across a term that mattered, she wrote a small note in the margin in neat block letters. From page 1 through page 6, she translated aloud for him in an even voice without emphasis. Identification of the parties involved in the agreement, the history of the business relationship, the general renewal clauses that were mostly formal in nature. Rhys gave the slightest nod at each point. Familiar. This was the part he already knew from previous contracts. The part Garrett always summarized for him in 2 minutes, and that he always ignored because it never changed. She moved on to page 7. Rhys stood beside the table, his arms folded across his chest, his eyes not on the document but on her face. He couldn't read Russian, but he could read people. 17 years in the business had taught him that the most dangerous moment never announced itself. It only appeared as a small change on the face of the person across from you, a slight furrow in the brow, a pen stopping in place, a breath held half a second longer than it should have been. And he was waiting for that moment on the face of the girl sitting at his kitchen table, reading his fate in pencil. On page 7, Elara's pencil stopped. Not a complete stop, but a slowing, like a wheel meeting a different stretch of road. She read the line again, her eyes moving backward from right to left across the Russian text, then wrote a short word in the margin in block letters. Rhys noticed the change at once. He didn't understand the words on the page, but he understood rhythm. For the first 6 pages, she had read with the steady pace of someone walking down a straight road. On page 7, the pace changed. From here, the language is different, she said without taking her eyes off the page. Her voice remained flat, without alarm, like a carpenter telling a homeowner that this wall has termon, not that the house is about to collapse. In the section covering obligations, the terminology was no longer the standard commercial Russian she had been reading in the first 6 pages. The new words had been chosen carefully, their meanings broader, their boundaries more blurred, the kind of language that, once placed before a court or on a negotiating table, either side could try to pull in the direction it wanted, but the side that had written it would always hold the advantage. Rhys understood immediately. Not because he understood Russian, but because he understood how traps were built. 17 years in the underworld had taught him that the most successful deception never looked like deception. It looked like legitimate paperwork, like a door that looks shut but doesn't have a lock, he said. She looked up at him for the first time since she had started reading, gave a single nod, then lowered her head and continued. The pages that followed kept the same surface appearance as the contracts Elara assumed Rhys was used to seeing. The structure was the same, the layout was the same, even the font and the numbering of the clauses were the same. But beneath that familiar shell, she marked every point of deviation in the margin with her pencil. Page 9. A term indicating duration had been replaced with a synonym whose range was twice as broad. Page 11. A comma had been placed in a different position from the standard usage, and that comma completely changed the meaning of the sentence, turning both parties' share responsibility into one party bears primary responsibility. Page 14. A reference to an appendix. Page 22. Another reference to the same appendix. Page 36. The third reference. Elara marked all 3 with pencil circles, then turned through the rest of the stack, searching for the appendix. It wasn't there. She straightened the papers and looked at Rhys. "There is an Appendix 3, she said. "It is cited 3 separate times in the body of the document, in 3 different places, but you haven't shown it to me." Rhys flinched. Not the kind of flinch that showed on the outside, but the kind that happened inside, the kind only a sharp eye would catch in the way his jaw tightened for half a second. He pulled the papers toward himself and flipped quickly to the back. The last 3 pages. He remembered then. In Moscow, when he had photographed the document in the conference room, the light had been fading because the meeting had run long, and no one had turned on any additional lamps. The last 3 pages had been photographed from farther away, at an angle, in weak light, and the right edge of each page had been cut off by about 20%, because he had been rushing before the Russian side took the document back. He pushed those 3 pages toward her without saying a word. He didn't need to say anything. They both understood that the 3 pages, with missing edges in the hands of a cleaning girl at a granite kitchen table, might contain the thing that would decide whether everything he owned still belonged to him or not. Elara pulled the 3 pages closer, tilted the paper under the light so the letters would emerge more clearly, and began to read. More slowly than the first 6 pages, more slowly even than page 7, slowly in the way of someone walking on thin ice and knowing it. Elara leaned so close to the page that Rhys could see her breath making the edge of the paper tremble slightly. The last 3 pages were the worst quality in the entire stack, the print faint along the right margin where the photograph had been cut off. But the rest was still readable if the person reading it knew what to look for. And Elara knew. She read the first page of the appendix once, slowly, her pencil moving along each line. She read it a second time, this time lingering over certain phrases, making notes in the margin. By the third reading, she focused only on section 2, especially the last line of that section. Her pencil stopped completely. She didn't write anything else. She simply looked at that line as if she were waiting for it to change its own meaning. It didn't. She set the pencil down on the table, sat up straight, and looked at Rhys. He was standing less than a step away from her, his arms folded, his entire body like a steel wire pulled tight and waiting to snap. "This clause doesn't transfer 40% of the organization to the Russian side," she said. Her voice was so calm that if someone had been standing outside the door and heard her without understanding the context, they might have thought she was talking about the weather forecast or the price of morning coffee. "It transfers 100%. Rhys didn't move, not because he was calm, but because his body had forgotten how to react when it heard something it had never prepared itself to hear. 100% meant everything. Every hotel, every casino, every shipping line, every account, every piece of real estate, everything his father had started from a small liquor store in Southie, and that he had built into an empire over 17 years, with blood, with sweat, with sleepless nights, with decisions ordinary people never had to make. Everything. "This isn't a contract," Elara continued, her eyes still on him. "This is a trap." She pulled the page closer and pointed to each line as she explained. Appendix 3 lists a set of obligations, and if any single one of them is violated, the entire Callahan organization is to be transferred to Volkov Corporation. Not part of it. Not a minority share. Not temporary management rights. The whole thing. And the conditions for breach are written so broadly that almost anyone would violate them sooner or later. A delay of 72 hours in responding to any formal communication from the corporation. Failure to appear at a meeting called with a minimum of 48 hours' notice. She stopped there, her fingers still resting on the line. 48 hours is too short to arrange an international meeting between Boston and Moscow, she said. In practice, once you factor in the time difference, travel time, and staff coordination, 48 hours is almost impossible. And the more dangerous part is this. The phrase formal communication is not defined anywhere in the entire 48 pages. There is no section explaining the term. There is no appendix defining it. The phrase hangs inside the document like the unlocked door she had mentioned on page 7, except this door doesn't open into an empty room, it opens into an abyss. That means the Russian side can decide for themselves what counts as formal communication anytime they want, she said. An email, a missed call, a message through any channel at all. If you don't respond within 72 hours, they have a legal basis to trigger the transfer clause. And because formal communication is never defined, you have no legal basis to challenge it. Rhys leaned back against the chair. Slowly, as if gravity had just doubled, the kitchen fell silent. The refrigerator gave off a faint low hum in the corner of the room. Morning light through the glass poured across the stack of papers on the table, across the pencil notes in the margins, across Elara's hand still resting on the page. Rhys didn't look at her. He looked down at the granite surface of the table, at the empty space between the cold coffee and the stack of documents, as if the answer to everything might be lying inside that blank space. In his world, losing the organization didn't mean losing money. Money could be made again. Losing the organization meant losing the shield. It meant losing the system of protection he had spent 17 years building around himself, around the people he was responsible for, around the Callahan name. And in this world, there was a name for the person left standing outside that shield. A name everyone knew but no one wanted to say out loud. Loose end. Something people cut away to keep things clean. Rhys knew how loose ends ended. He had seen it. He had given the orders. And now, for the first time in 17 years, he was staring at the possibility that he might become one. Garrett Flynn wasn't the kind of man who waited for a problem to solve itself. He was the kind who solved problems before they even knew they were problems. The security camera system in Rhys's penthouse had been designed and installed by Garrett himself 8 years earlier, when the Callahan organization began expanding into the casino business, and the number of enemies started rising faster than the number of partners. 32 cameras, every corner of every room, every hallway, every entrance, all of it feeding into a server that Garrett kept separate access to alongside Rhys because he was the highest-ranking head of security. Rhys trusted him enough that he had never once thought about taking that access back. That night, in his private apartment in Back Bay, 20 minutes by car from the penthouse, Garrett opened his laptop, logged into the camera system, and rewound the morning footage. He saw everything. Elara sitting at the kitchen table with the stack of 48 pages in front of her, pencil in hand, making notes in the margins. Rhys standing beside her, arms folded, eyes fixed on her face. The cameras recorded no audio. Garrett had set it up that way because Rhys himself had requested it. No one wanted conversations inside the penthouse to be recorded. But Garrett didn't need to hear. He saw enough. The cleaning girl was reading Russian documents. The cleaning girl was taking notes. The cleaning girl was saying something to Rhys, and Rhys was listening. Garrett fast-forwarded to the moment Rhys leaned back in his chair after Elara finished explaining Appendix 3. He looked at Rhys's body language and understood at once that the thing Garrett feared most had happened. Rhys no longer trusted him. Not completely, not yet, but enough to begin asking questions. Garrett didn't want anyone asking. Garrett closed the laptop and sat still for 30 seconds. Then he picked up his phone. He didn't call Rhys. He called Mike Hargrove, the regional manager of All Clean Services, the contract cleaning company that supplied staff to the penthouse. He called his personal number at 9 o'clock at night, outside business hours. The call itself was already a message. This couldn't wait until morning. Garrett spoke to Hargrove in the voice he used when he needed someone to move quickly without asking too much. A voice that was polite but heavy. The kind of voice that carried the weight of money and consequences behind it. The replacement employee your company sent over listened in on a client's private line without permission. Worse, she made direct contact with an important international business partner and created a situation that could affect an extremely sensitive commercial relationship. Garrett didn't say she knew Russian. He didn't say she had written down every word perfectly. He didn't say she had translated 48 pages of legal documents at the kitchen table. He said only enough. Exactly the amount of truth required to make Hargrove feel that if he didn't act immediately, the lucrative cleaning contract with the Seaport District penthouse would be gone before the weekend. The termination notice was sent to Elara's phone at 10 o'clock that night. A short message from All Clean Services. Contract terminated effective immediately. Reason: violation of client procedure. Do not return to the worksite. But Garrett didn't stop there. He opened an encrypted messaging app, selected the name of one of his men, and typed 3 words. She heard too much. In the world Garrett lived in and breathed in and calculated through every day, those 3 words weren't a comment. They weren't a complaint. They weren't an ordinary warning. Those 3 words were a sentence. They were a way of saying that someone knew too much to be allowed to walk back out into the world and continue a normal life. Elara read the termination message on the bed in the 3rd-floor guest room of the penthouse, where she had been assigned to sleep during the temporary placement. She read it once, put the phone into her pocket, didn't read it again, didn't call All Clean back, didn't draft a message protesting or asking for a detailed reason. She lay still in the dark, eyes open, and began to calculate. Rent for the studio apartment in Dorchester, $950 a month. Split with a roommate came to $475. Silver Line Pass, $90 a month. Food, if she cooked at home, around $200. Balance in her bank account, $1,300 and some loose cents, divided by the minimum monthly cost. Not even 2 months. No panic. Calculation. She had done this calculation more times in her life than anyone should ever have to. The first time had been when she was 14, when her 5th foster family returned her to the system, and she had to figure out how many days the food in her backpack would last. Panic burned calories. She had learned that early. Energy spent on fear was energy that couldn't be used to solve a problem. She closed her eyes. Not to sleep. To rest. Because tomorrow, she was going to need everything she had. Elara opened her eyes at 4:45 in the morning, 15 minutes before the alarm she never needed. The darkness in the 3rd-floor guest room was still thick, with only the city lights filtering through the curtains and drawing a thin line across the ceiling. She lay still for 30 seconds, not because she was still sleepy, but because she was running through the list in her head again, the list of everything that had to be done before she left this place, in the right order, nothing missing, nothing extra. Then she sat up. A quick shower in the secondary bathroom, the water cold because she didn't want the hot water system making noise and waking anyone. She put on her regular clothes, not the uniform, because as of today, the uniform no longer belonged to her. She folded the blanket exactly the way she had found it on the first day. The edge of the blanket squared with the edge of the bed, the pillow placed in the center. Not a single wrinkle. She wiped the bedside table with a damp cloth, even though it was already clean. Checked the bathroom one last time and wiped the water spots from the mirror. When she closed the door behind her and stepped into the hallway, the room looked exactly the way it had the day she first walked into it, as if no one had ever stayed there. No trace, no strand of hair, only the smell of clean. She went down to the kitchen by the back stairs, her footsteps light on the wooden floor. The penthouse was completely silent. Rhys somewhere on the second floor, probably still in the study where he had spent most of the night before. She opened the cabinet, took out the ground coffee, and turned on the machine. While it brewed, she washed the cup, wiped the counter, and put everything back exactly where it belonged. When the coffee was ready, she poured it into the white ceramic mug she had noticed Rhys used every morning and set it on the granite island, right where he usually stood. Then she sat down in the chair across from it, took a blank sheet of paper and a pen from her backpack, both things she always carried, and began to write. Not long. It didn't need to be. First line, "Thank you, Mr. Callahan, for the time I was allowed to work here." Second line, "Notice of departure in accordance with instructions from all clean services, effective immediately." Third line, "Wishing you success in resolving the matters currently open." 3 lines in English, clear handwriting, black ink on white paper, not one unnecessary word. Then below that, after leaving a space, she wrote 1 line in Russian. The Cyrillic letters moved steadily across the page, each stroke of the pen firm as though she were copying from a book instead of from memory. But it was from memory. The sentence Dmitry Volkov had spoken at the end of the call on the day she answered the phone, the sentence she had written on the paper she slid to Rhys but only in English translation. Now, she wrote in the original Russian, because she knew the original always carried more weight than the translation. Beneath the Russian line, she wrote the English translation word for word. The current document does not match the document discussed in March. And then 1 final line, short, exact wording, in case needed. She signed it. Elara. No last name. No title. Just the name. She folded the sheet, slipped it into a white envelope from the drawer beside the kitchen, didn't seal it, only tucked the flap inside. She placed the envelope against the coffee mug on the granite counter. The coffee was still hot. The envelope touched warm ceramic. She looked at the two of them sitting side by side for 3 seconds, then turned away. She picked up her backpack from beside the shoe cabinet, slipped it over her shoulder, and walked toward the service entrance at the end of the first-floor hallway. Ray Whitmore was sitting in the security room beside the side door, as he was every morning, the camera monitors in front of him, a cup of coffee by his right hand. She stopped in front of the glass. "Good morning." Ray didn't look up. His finger pressed the button to unlock the service gate remotely, a reflex he had performed hundreds of times for hundreds of different cleaning employees, without needing to know a name, without needing to know a face. The side gate opened with the familiar electronic click. Elara stepped through and out onto the sidewalk in the Seaport District. The sky was still gray, the sun not yet up, and the November air in Boston was cold enough for her to see her breath turn into a faint cloud in front of her. 4 blocks to the Silver Line station, she walked slowly. Not because she was tired, not because she was sad, but because there was nowhere waiting for her, and she had learned a long time ago that when nowhere is waiting, there is no reason to hurry toward any place at all. Rhys came down to the kitchen at 6:15. His hair wasn't combed, yesterday's shirt was wrinkled beyond saving, and his eyes still carried the marks of yet another night without real sleep. He walked straight toward the coffee machine the way he did every morning, but stopped when he saw that the white ceramic mug was already sitting on the granite counter, still warm, a faint thread of steam rising beneath the kitchen lights, and beside the mug, a white envelope leaned against the side of the ceramic. He looked at the coffee, looked at the envelope, looked around the kitchen. Silence, no footsteps, no running water, no fabric brushing wood, the kind of silence a house holds after someone has just left it. He picked up the envelope, opened the folded flap, and pulled out the sheet of paper. He read the first 3 lines in English. "Thank you, notice of departure," wishing him success in resolving what was open. He read them quickly, almost skimming, because those 3 lines weren't what held his eyes. What held his eyes was the line beneath them, a handwritten line in Cyrillic, the strokes firm and even, every character as clear as print. He couldn't read Russian, but he recognized it as Russian, and beneath that line was the English translation. The current document does not match the document discussed in March. He read the translation once, then a second time, then a third. Each time the sentence didn't change, but its weight did. If the current document was different from the one in March, then someone had altered it somewhere along the way. Not a printing mistake, not an administrative error. Someone, a specific person with specific access, had opened the file, edited it, saved it, and sent out a new version as if it were the original. And Dmitry Volkov had said that sentence to Elara over the phone in a natural voice, almost casually, the way people comment on the weather. That meant Dmitry either didn't yet know where the change had come from, or he knew and hadn't wanted to say it directly. Either possibility led to the same place. The alteration hadn't come from the Russian side, it had come from his side, from someone standing close to him. Rhys set the paper down on the counter. The final line before the signature read, exact wording, in case needed. In case needed. The cleaning girl had been fired at 10 o'clock the night before, had woken early to make coffee for a stranger, had left behind a note containing information that could change everything, then had walked out through the service entrance without waiting for anyone to thank her, without waiting for anyone to ask her to stay. She had simply left it there, in case needed. Rhys picked up his phone. He called All Clean Services. Voicemail. Automated system. No live person yet, because it was still early. He called again, selected the emergency contact option, and was transferred to the shift manager on duty. I need the personal contact number for the employee named Elara Voss, assigned to Seaport District. Contract code 743. His voice wasn't asking. It was requiring. The kind of voice that made the person listening understand that saying no wasn't really an option. The manager gave him the number in less than a minute. Rhys called. Elara was walking along a Seaport District sidewalk, 4 blocks from the penthouse, near the Silver Line station. The early Boston air cut against her cheeks. Her backpack hung from one shoulder, and the earphones in her coat pocket were playing an Italian lesson she had already listened to for the 3rd time that week. Her phone vibrated. Unknown number. She pulled out the earphones and answered. Hello? She recognized the voice on the other end immediately, not because she knew it well, but because it was the kind of voice that, once heard, wasn't forgotten. Low, spare, every word heavier than ordinary words. Where are you? There was no question mark in the sentence, but it was still a question. 4 blocks away, near the Silver Line station. A short silence on the other end. Then, can you come back? Elara stopped in the middle of the sidewalk. A man in a windbreaker passed behind her, brushed lightly against her backpack, said sorry, and kept walking. She didn't move. Why? Because I read the note. She didn't answer right away. 2 seconds. 3 seconds. Not hesitation. Assessment. She had seen the gun beneath his suit jacket on the first day. She had sat in his kitchen reading documents whose contents could get people killed. She had been fired 12 hours after translating 48 pages for him, and she was smart enough to know that kind of coincidence wasn't coincidence. Coming back meant stepping deeper into something whose boundaries she still hadn't measured. Something with guns, with Russian on an encrypted line, with altered documents, and with at least one person willing to fire her in the middle of the night, simply because she knew how to read. I can come back, she said, her voice as flat as ever, but I need to know what I'm stepping into. The silence lasted longer this time. She could hear him breathing through the phone, even and slow, the breathing of a man deciding how much of the truth he should say. Then he said, Fair, I'll tell you. She ended the call, stood another 5 seconds on the sidewalk, looking at the Silver Line station at the end of the street, where an early morning train had just stopped and opened its doors. Then she turned around and walked the 4 blocks back toward the penthouse. When she reached the service entrance, Ray Whitmore was still sitting in the security room. She pressed the bell. Ray looked up at the camera monitor and saw her, and for the first time since the day she had entered this building, Ray Whitmore lifted his head and looked at her. Not a glance before looking away. A real look. His eyes stayed on her face for 2 seconds before his finger pressed the button to open the gate. He didn't say anything, but that look said enough. It said that something had changed, even if he didn't yet know exactly what it was. When Elara walked into the kitchen for the 2nd time that morning, Rhys was already seated at the table, not standing against the counter the way he usually did, but sitting, both hands resting on the tabletop, the stack of 48 pages lying between them, the envelope she had left beside it. The coffee she had made for him still hadn't been touched. He watched her come in and said nothing until she sat down in the chair across from him and placed her backpack at her feet. Then he began to speak. No introduction, no circling around the point, none of the polished lead and powerful men usually used when speaking to people beneath them in rank. He spoke directly, his voice lower than usual, each word chosen with the care of a man diffusing an explosive and knowing that one wrong move could cost him a hand. This document was given to me in Moscow last week as a renewal of a cooperation agreement that's been in place for 12 years, he said. But it doesn't look like any renewal I've seen before. There's a signature on the last page that looks like mine, and I don't remember signing it. There are clauses in it like the ones you found yesterday. The kind of clauses no one puts in a cooperation contract unless they intend to turn it into something else. He paused for a second, looked at her, not to measure her reaction, but to decide how much he should say. Then he went on. The entire international division of my organization is managed by one man. He's been beside me for 22 years. My father took him in off the street when he was 14. He ate at my family's table, grew up beside me, stood next to me on nights when no one else would have dared stand there. He's the only one with access to the international contract files, the one who hired the interpreter, the one who deals directly with the other side, the one who confirms the contents before I sign. He didn't say Garrett's name. He didn't need to. They both knew exactly who he meant. And he didn't say the word mafia. He didn't say the word kill. He didn't say the word death. But his voice said enough. It was the voice of a man describing the distance between himself and an abyss. And that distance was shorter than he had believed. If this document takes effect the way you said it would yesterday, he said, I lose everything. Not lose it in the way people mean bankruptcy. Sell the house, pay the debts, and start over. Lose it in the way people don't get to start over from. The last sentence came out softer than the ones before it. Soft enough that she had to lean forward half an inch to hear it clearly. And she understood that soft didn't mean less important. Soft, in the way he spoke, meant most dangerous. Elara listened to all of it without interrupting even once. She didn't nod. She didn't shake her head. She didn't let a single expression cross her face to reveal what she was thinking. When he stopped, the silence between them stretched for 4 seconds. Then she asked one question, and only one. What exactly do you need me to do? Not, how can I help? Not, what do you want me to do? What exactly do you need me to do? It was a small difference, but Rhys heard it immediately. Her question wasn't an offer. It was the question of someone who had already decided she was going to do it, and only needed to know the scope. A complete translation, he said. Every page, every term, in writing. I need a translation I can put on the table in front of my lawyers, and in front of the other side, and no one will be able to say it's wrong. She nodded. One single nod, short and decisive. Then she said, I need a laptop, a quiet desk, and no one standing behind me while I work. Rhys looked at her. One corner of his mouth shifted slightly. Not enough to be called a smile, but closer to a smile than anything she had seen from him since the day she entered this penthouse. Not because what she said was funny, but because in the 22 years he had lived in the world he lived in, very few people had ever dared tell him what they needed when he was asking them for help. Most people only nodded and then searched for ways to please him. She, on the other hand, told him plainly what she needed in order to do her best work. And that, to Rhys Callahan, was worth more than any promise. He stood, walked ahead of her, led her up to the second floor, and into the study. He opened the laptop on the oak desk, signed in, and pulled out the chair. The printed document was already waiting on the desk beside a pencil and a glass of water. Then he stepped out and closed the door, leaving her alone in the room where, for the past 17 years, no one except him and Garrett had ever sat down to work. The study door closed, and Elara sat down in the leather chair before the oak desk. She didn't begin right away. First, she arranged everything. The printed 48-page document on the left, the laptop open to a blank page on the right, the pencil and glass of water in the middle. She pulled the chair closer to the desk, adjusted the laptop screen so the light from the window wouldn't glare across it, then placed her hands on the keyboard and began. No hesitation, no deep breath, no dramatic moment. She simply began, the way a carpenter picks up a saw because that is the next thing that needs to be done. She translated page by page, from top to bottom, from left to right, not skipping a single line, not even the small print at the bottom of the pages that most readers would skim past. Every time she came across a term that deviated from standard commercial Russian, she added a note in brackets, explaining what the original term would normally be, what term the document used instead, and what legal consequence that difference created. Each note was brief, 2 or 3 lines, no longer than necessary, but enough for a lawyer who didn't know Russian to understand why the term was a problem. The 3 clauses she judged most dangerous were marked with 3 stars at the beginning of the line. The clause about the 72-hour response deadline, the clause about the right to call a meeting within 48 hours, and the clause transferring total ownership in Appendix 3. Before translating Appendix 3, she paused, opened a separate section, and wrote in plain English a half-page summary explaining, for someone with no legal background and no Russian, exactly what consequences this appendix allowed to happen. She wrote clearly, if triggered, the entire Callahan organization would transfer to Volkov Corporation. Not part of it, not gradually, but the whole thing, and immediately, as soon as any one of the breach conditions was activated. And those conditions were written so broadly that violating them in the course of ordinary business was almost impossible to avoid. She finished that section, read it once, changed one word, then continued with the appendix itself. 3 hours. Without standing up, without drinking water, without checking her phone, without looking out the window, 3 straight hours in which the only sound from the study was the tapping of keys and, now and then, the sound of a page turning. Outside, Rhys sat on the living room sofa on the first floor, his phone in his hand, but making no calls. His eyes stayed on the staircase leading to the second floor, where the study door remained shut. He could hear the faint tapping of the keyboard through the wooden floor, steady, uninterrupted, like the heartbeat of someone deeply focused. His phone vibrated 3 times that morning. All 3 messages were from Garrett Flynn. The first, at 8 o'clock. Sleep well, didn't you? I was exhausted too, so I headed home early. The second, at 9:30. I'll come by this afternoon. There are a few things we need to discuss in person. Not good over the phone. The third, at 10:15. I'll come by at 3. If you're busy, let me know and I can move it. The third message didn't ask whether it was okay. It set the time first, then added a polite sentence after it. Rhys read all 3 messages. He didn't answer any of them. Not because he didn't know what to say yet, but because anything he typed right now would reveal either too much or too little, and both were dangerous. He placed the phone face down on the sofa cushion and kept sitting there, listening to the sound of typing from upstairs. At 12:10, the typing stopped. Then came the sound of a chair scraping lightly across the wooden floor. Then soft footsteps on the stairs. Elara appeared at the top of the staircase to the first floor, the laptop already open in her hands. She walked down, came to where he was sitting, placed the laptop on the coffee table in front of the sofa, and turned the screen toward him. 48 pages, fully translated, with complete annotations. The 3 dangerous clauses marked. The explanatory section on Appendix 3, on page 39. Rhys pulled the laptop closer and began to read. Slowly, page by page, note by note, he reached page 39 and read the section she had written, then read it again. He stayed on the final page longer than he had stayed on all the others put together. Then he looked up. Is it enough to challenge the document? His voice was dry, the kind of dry that belongs to a man who has gone all day without water and hasn't noticed. Enough, Elara said. This translation is accurate enough to place beside the original in front of any lawyer and point to each place where the language was deliberately altered. She paused for half a second. But it isn't enough to prove who changed the document on purpose. To prove that, we need the March original for comparison. The version both sides agreed on before it was altered. I don't have that version. The Russian side does. Rhys looked at her, then looked back down at the laptop screen. At the 48 pages, the cleaning girl had just turned from something he couldn't read into something he could use as a weapon. He didn't say thank you, but the way he looked at that translation, carefully, slowly, as if he were looking at something that had just saved him before he had fully realized it, said more than those 2 words ever could. The intercom on the kitchen wall buzzed at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, exactly as Garrett had said in his 3rd message. Ray Whitmore's voice came through the speaker, flat and emotionless. Mr. Flynn is upstairs, asking if he can come in. Rhys was sitting at the kitchen table across from Elara. The laptop was still open between them, the 48-page translation glowing on the screen. He looked at her. 2 words. Stay here. It wasn't an invitation to remain. It was an order. Elara didn't move, didn't close the laptop, didn't stand up, didn't show any sign that she intended to leave. She simply remained exactly where she was, pencil in hand, eyes on the document, as if his words had only confirmed a decision she had already made for herself. Rhys pressed the intercom button. Let him in. Footsteps in the hallway, confident, steady footsteps. The kind of stride a man used in a space he considered his own home. Garrett Flynn walked into the kitchen in a perfectly tailored gray suit, his hair neatly combed, a smile already on his face before his eyes had even settled on anyone in the room. Then his gaze swept across the kitchen table, and the smile didn't vanish, but his eyes changed, only slightly, in the way that only someone who had known Garrett for 22 years the way Rhys had would catch. His pupils narrowed for a tenth of a second. The jaw tightened faintly under clean-shaven skin. Then everything returned to normal so quickly that a blink at the wrong moment would have missed it entirely. Elara was sitting there, the laptop open, the printed document stacked beside it, the pencil in her hand. The cleaning girl he had fired 17 hours earlier was sitting at Rhys Callahan's kitchen table with 48 pages of Russian documents. "Didn't know you had company," Garrett said, his voice still warm, still light, still tuned exactly to the register of an old friend dropping by on a weekend afternoon. "Not company," Rhys said. "Work." Garrett pulled out a chair and sat at the head of the table, the place where he had always sat every time he came to the penthouse over the past 22 years. He placed his elbows on the table, clasped his hands in front of him, and settled into the posture of a man preparing to explain something complicated to people who didn't understand it. Then he began to speak. Technical language in international contracts usually has a certain degree of elasticity. That's standard, not exceptional. The Russian side has confirmed that there is no intention beyond protecting both parties' interests. This kind of clause is a standard protective practice that Volkov Corporation applies in all major contracts, and it has never been activated in any previous case. Every sentence Garrett spoke contained exactly enough truth to sound reasonable. Not too much to be verifiable, not too little to sound suspicious. That was Garrett Flynn's talent. He didn't lie, he blended, and the ratio was always perfect. He had been speaking for about 3 minutes when Elara spoke. She didn't lift her head. Her eyes remained on the document, the pencil still in her hand, as if the sentence she uttered were nothing more than a side note that had accidentally slipped out into the air. "Do you have that in writing?" Garrett turned toward her. The smile was still there, but it had thinned by one layer. "Excuse me? That it's standard and has never been activated. Do you have any document confirming that?" Silence for 3 seconds. 3 seconds in that kitchen felt longer than 3 ordinary seconds. Garrett opened both hands on the table, a gesture of reasonableness, a gesture he had used thousands of times in thousands of negotiations. That's not the kind of thing that's put in writing. It's market practice. Anyone in the industry knows it. "So it's only words," Elara said, her voice flat, with no emphasis, no sarcasm, no challenge. She was only stating a simple fact the way someone says it's raining when it's raining. Then she returned to the page she was reading, as if the part of the conversation that involved her had already ended. Garrett looked at her for 2 seconds. Then he turned back to Rhys, changing direction as smoothly and quickly as a professional driver taking a curve. His voice dropped by half a tone, more intimate now, the kind of tone used only between brothers. "Rhys, you're letting a temporary cleaning employee steer a decision in a deal that's been running for 12 years. She doesn't have the background, doesn't have negotiation experience, doesn't understand how this world works." He didn't say temporary cleaning employee with contempt. Worse than that, he said it with pity. The way an adult gently explains to a child that the world is more complicated than they think. Elara didn't react. Her eyes stayed on the page. Her hand still held the pencil. Her body didn't move a millimeter, as if the sentence didn't exist, or as if she had heard it too many times in her life for it to have any effect anymore. Rhys spoke. His voice didn't rise, but it became quieter. And Elara, though she hadn't known Rhys long enough yet to read all his signals, still understood that when his voice grew quieter, it wasn't a sign that he was backing down. It was the most dangerous sign of all. "She can read technical Russian," Rhys said, each word as clear as a brick being laid into a wall. "You can't." Silence. Garrett didn't answer at once, and that pause revealed more than anything he could have said. "I'm going to call Dmitri," Rhys continued. "I want to see the March original, the version both sides agreed to before someone altered it." Garrett Flynn's face at that moment was something Elara would remember for a long time afterward, not because it twisted or collapsed, but because it did the opposite. It emptied, completely. For the first time in 22 years, the face that had always been able to produce the right expression for every situation couldn't find a single expression at all. Like an actor forgetting his lines in the middle of the stage, the lights still on, the audience still watching, but nothing coming out. Garrett rose from the chair with the same slow, controlled movement that marked everything he did. He fastened the button of his suit jacket with one hand, then gave Rhys a slight nod, the kind of nod an outsider would have read as polite, but in truth, he was buying himself time to arrange the next move in his head. He walked past the kitchen table, past where Elara sat, toward the hallway door. Then he stopped. He didn't turn fully, only tilted his head just enough for his eyes to meet hers from the side. Careful what you hear inside these walls. Some things you can't unhear. His voice was light. He was smiling. The kind of smile that, if caught on silent security footage, would have looked like a friendly goodbye. But in that silent kitchen, with less than 2 steps between him and her, each word weighed far more than its literal meaning. Then he walked away. The kitchen door closed, footsteps in the hallway, the elevator opening, the elevator closing. Silence. Elara's hand holding the pencil stopped for half a second on the page. That half second was all she allowed the threat to take from her. Then the pencil moved again, her handwriting steady as if nothing had happened. She knew the smell of a threat, not in the way people know it from books or films, but in the way someone who has lived with it knows it. The 4th foster family, the blonde man who always wore flannel, whose voice was softest right before a beer bottle flew across the room, the alley behind the high school in South Boston, where the gentlest sounding words often came with the heaviest consequences. She had learned very early that the most dangerous threats were never shouted. They were whispered, paired with a smile, carried in a tone that, if you repeated it to someone else later, would make them say you probably misunderstood. It sounded normal to me. Garrett Flynn's sentence carried the exact same smell as the flannel man, saying sleep well, before turning off the light in her room when she was 12. Same smell, different man. Rhys watched her after the kitchen door had closed. He saw her hand pause for half a second, and then keep writing, and he understood that the half second said more than any other reaction could have said. He'll try to contact Dimitri before the video call, Rhys said. Elara looked up. I know. If I were in his position, I'd do the same. Rhys tilted his head, still not used to hearing someone read the next move as quickly as he did. Suggestions? Call Dimitri tonight. Don't explain anything. Don't mention the document. Don't mention this afternoon's meeting. Just confirm the video call for 10 tomorrow morning and say there will be an interpreter joining. She paused for one beat. That will be enough for the Russian side to understand that the conversation will happen in Russian, without a middleman. If Garrett tries to call Dimitri afterward, Dimitri will already know that Rhys is preparing for a completely different meeting from the one Garrett has described. And Garrett won't know that Dimitri knows. Rhys looked at her for 3 seconds. Then he picked up his phone and called Dmitry Volkov. The call was brief, less than 2 minutes. English, polite, proper, formal. Confirming the video meeting at 10 the next morning, saying there would be an interpreter, saying he hoped to speak directly. Dmitry answered briefly, agreed, and asked nothing more. That night, the two of them sat in the study on the 2nd floor, Rhys in the leather chair behind the desk, Elara in the chair across from him. The document and the translation spread between them. She was preparing the points that needed to be presented in the meeting, arranging them from least dangerous to most dangerous, so the conversation could move naturally from safe ground into the critical zone, without making the Russian side defensive too early. Rhys watched her work. Then he asked, suddenly, in a voice different from the one he had used all day, softer, closer. Why Russian? She stopped writing. Not because the question surprised her, but because the answer wasn't something she told people often. My mother was Eastern European, she said. She died when I was 11. Cancer. Public hospital, no insurance. The last thing she said was a sentence in Russian that I didn't understand. I sat beside her bed, listened to her say it, and didn't understand a single word. She looked down at the paper in front of her. It took me 3 years to teach myself enough Russian to translate that sentence from memory. When I finally did, it said, "Don't be afraid. Mama is here." She didn't tell him about sitting on the kitchen floor and crying. She didn't need to. Rhys was silent. Not the silence of calculation or judgment, but the silence of someone who had just realized he was sitting across from someone whose wound looked more like his own than he had expected. Then he spoke, his voice so low it was almost as if he were speaking to himself. My father died in front of me when I was 19, in the family restaurant, 2 gunshots. The last thing he said to me was, "Don't look down." He stopped. I looked down. The silence in the study stretched longer than any silence between them since the day they met. This was the first time Rhys Callahan had ever said that sentence to anyone. 17 years of holding it inside his chest, through hundreds of sleepless nights, through thousands of conversations in which he controlled every word that left his mouth. And he said it to the cleaning girl sitting across from him in the study at 11 at night. Elara didn't say, "I'm sorry." She didn't say, "I understand how you feel." She didn't say any of the things people usually say when they don't know what to say. She only nodded. A small, slow nod, the kind that comes from someone who understands without needing to hear one word more. Then both of them turned back to the document. Neither of them said anything else about it. But the air in the room had changed, lighter by 0.5 gram, enough for both of them to feel it, not enough for either of them to have to name it. At 9:40 in the morning, Elara was already seated at the desk on the second floor. The printed document had been divided into 5 sections, with different colored paper clips. Blue for the history of cooperation, yellow for the general clauses, red for the 3 dangerous provisions, black for Appendix 3, and white for the notes and questions she had prepared for the meeting. The translation on the laptop was already open to page 39, the section explaining the appendix. Beside the laptop sat a cup of coffee she had made for herself at 9 o'clock, still hot. She was wearing a white shirt she had folded carefully in her backpack, not the cleaning uniform, not because she wanted to impress anyone, but because she understood that on a video call screen, with men in black suits sitting in Moscow, a cleaning uniform would speak before she ever opened her mouth, and what it said wouldn't help anyone. Rhys walked into the room at 9:50. His tie was slightly crooked to the left, the eyes of a man who had slept little but had slept, completely different from the 2 nights before. He looked at the desk, looked at the way she had arranged the papers, looked at the colored clips, and said nothing. He didn't need to. She had prepared more thoroughly than any hired interpreter he had ever worked with. Garrett wasn't there. He had sent 3 messages earlier that morning. The first said that this was his right as a partner. The second said that his absence would send the wrong signal to the Russian side. The third said that he would come no matter what. Rhys had replied to the last message with 5 words. "Meeting's been arranged, thanks." There was no invitation in those 5 words. Garrett didn't come. At exactly 10 o'clock, Rhys pressed the button to connect. The screen lit up. On the other side, Dmitry Volkov sat in the center of the frame. Black suit, dark tie, back straight, both hands resting on the table. Behind him, 2 advisors sat with 1 empty chair between them, also in black suits, also with straight backs, one holding a pen over a blank pad of paper ready to take notes, the other with his hands on a laptop. The composition on the screen had been arranged deliberately, conveying seriousness before a single word was spoken. Dmitry greeted Rhys in English, his tone formal and polite, the kind of greeting between 2 men who had known each other long enough not to ask after each other's health anymore but still maintained proper form. Rhys greeted him back, briefly, then introduced Elara, interpreter and document advisor for today's meeting. Dmitry looked at her through the screen. 1 second, then a small shift crossed his face. Not surprise, but recognition. The voice from the phone call on the day she had answered the encrypted hard line. He remembered. Elara began in Russian. Not the conversational Russian she had used on the phone that day, but formal Russian, with exactly the right honorific level for a person of power on the other end. The kind of language a diplomat would use to open a high-level negotiation. Every syllable was clear, every honorific in its correct place. Her voice dignified without arrogance, respectful without servility. The advisor on Dmitry's left leaned over and murmured something to the advisor on the right. Dmitry didn't turn toward them, but gave the faintest nod, the kind of nod that acknowledged what had just been said, without needing to hear the full sentence. Elara took the lead, not simultaneous interpreting in the usual sense, where one side spoke and she simply translated for the other, but a real conversation in Russian that she controlled in rhythm and direction, occasionally turning to deliver the essential points to Rhys in concise, exact English, then returning to Russian without breaking the flow. She opened on safe ground, the 12-year history of cooperation, the value both sides had built together, the respect the Callahan organization held for Volkov Corporation, and the goodwill to resolve any misunderstanding in a spirit of transparency. This was language Dmitry knew and respected, his shoulders lowered by 2 centimeters. The advisor on the left set his pen down and stopped writing, simply listened. The entire room on the other side of the screen was listening to a 27-year-old girl from South Boston speak Russian in a way they couldn't fault. Then she moved to Appendix 3. Not abruptly, not dramatically, without any change in tone. She entered that section the way someone turns into the next street on the way home, naturally and without warning. She presented the clause in the exact technical language the document used, read aloud the two most important lines word for word, then placed them beside the standard wording used in the earlier contract. The difference became visible without her needing to point at it. She didn't accuse. She didn't suggest that anyone had done wrong. She laid it out as though this were an administrative error the Russian side perhaps hadn't yet noticed. And she trusted that once they did notice it, they would want to correct it. It was the smartest possible approach in a situation like this, because it gave Dmitri a way out without costing him face. Then she asked, directly, clearly, one single question in formal Russian. Was this appendix included in the version of the document discussed in March? Elara's question landed in the meeting room in Moscow like a stone falling onto a frozen lake. No loud sound, but the cracks spread in every direction. Dmitri Volkov didn't answer at once. He looked at her through the screen for 2 seconds without blinking. The kind of look a man gives when he is weighing the exact weight of every word he has just heard. Then he said, in Russian, briefly, "Give me a minute." He turned to the advisor on his left and said something the microphone didn't catch clearly. The advisor nodded, stood up, and stepped out of frame. The advisor on the right opened his laptop and typed quickly, his eyes moving across the screen in search of something. Dmitri sat still, both hands resting on the table, his back still straight, his face giving nothing away. On this side of the screen, Rhys sat motionless, his eyes never leaving the frame even though he didn't understand a single word being exchanged on the other side. He watched the body language, watched the way Dmitri turned toward his advisor, watched how fast the advisor typed, watched the space between Elara's question and the Russian side's reaction, and every second that passed without Dmitri answering was another second confirming that the question didn't have a simple answer. Elara waited. She sat perfectly still, her hands resting on the table, her face turned toward the screen, not typing on the keyboard, not turning a page, not drinking her coffee, not making any small movement that could fill the silence. Because she knew, from the 11 languages she had learned and the thousands of hours she had spent listening to people speak in every kind of tongue, that silence after the right question is the strongest thing in any negotiation. To break it is to break your own advantage with your own hands. She didn't break it. 1 minute and 15 seconds later, the advisor on the left returned to the frame, carrying a stack of papers, and placed it in front of Dmitri. The advisor on the right turned the laptop toward Dmitri and pointed to something on the screen. Dmitri looked at the papers, looked at the laptop, then turned back to the camera. When he spoke, his voice had changed. Not louder or softer, but different, heavier. "We have found the March original," he said in Russian, each word laid down like a brick. "We are comparing it to the current version." He stopped, looked down at the papers in front of him again, as if he needed to confirm one last time that his own eyes weren't deceiving him. Then he looked up. Appendix 3 is not in the original. 7 words. 7 words confirming everything Elara had read, had translated, had marked in pencil in the margins, had written into a plain language explanation before the appendix. 7 words confirming that someone had inserted Appendix 3 into the document sometime between March and last week, turning a renewal agreement into a trap designed to transfer the entire Callahan organization. Dmitri's face in that moment was something Rhys didn't need translated to understand. Not angry, not embarrassed, not panicked, but grave in the coldest possible way. The face of a man who had just realized he had been used as a tool for something he never would have accepted. In Dmitri Volkov's world, commercial honor wasn't an abstract idea. It was the foundation every agreement stood on, and someone had just dug beneath that foundation, without his knowledge. Dmitri stated, his voice even, not a single word wasted. Volkov Corporation is suspending the altered document with immediate effect. An internal audit will be conducted to determine who inserted Appendix 3, when it was inserted, and through which channel. The findings will be shared with the Callahan side. Then he paused. When he spoke again, his voice dropped by half a tone, and Elara recognized at once that the shift wasn't accidental. "Mr. Callahan," he said, "in our world, the man who betrays trust doesn't only lose the contract. I advise you to act quickly. before I have to act in my own way." Elara translated for Rhys word for word, adding nothing, taking nothing away, softening nothing. They both understood. Dmitri wasn't threatening. He was informing. If Rhys didn't remove the traitor, Volkov would do it himself. And Volkov's way didn't involve a trial, civil litigation, or some polite meeting to dissolve an arrangement. Volkov's way was permanent. A short silence followed. Then Dmitri spoke the final sentence before ending the call, his voice returning to normal, polite, as if the warning he had just given had never existed. "Thank your interpreter." She asked the right question, in the right way. The screen went dark. The study on the second floor fell into silence. Light from the window spilled across the desk, across the documents, across the colored paper clips, across the cup of coffee that had gone cold. Rhys let out a breath. Long, slow, deep. The kind of breath a man releases after holding it for 3 days, and finally being allowed to inhale again. He didn't look at Elara right away. He looked at the black screen in front of him, where Dmitri Volkov's face had just disappeared. And in the dark reflection on that screen, he saw his own face, exhausted, relieved, and for the first time in 17 years, grateful to someone whose name he hadn't even known a week earlier. That afternoon, 3 hours after the screen went dark, the study on the second floor was rearranged. Elara's documents and colored paper clips were moved to one side. On the oak desk now sat only 2 things, 2 versions of the document placed side by side. On the left, the March original that Dmitri Volkov had sent to Rhys through encrypted email less than an hour after the video meeting, with no Appendix 3, ending at page 42. On the right, the altered version Rhys had brought back from Moscow, 48 pages, with Appendix 3, with the clause transferring 100% ownership. The 6-page difference between the 2 versions lay there on the wood, like silent evidence that needed no one to explain it. Petra Morozova sat at the head of the table, Rhys's private attorney, a Russian-American woman, 55 years old, with short silver hair, thin-framed glasses, the kind of person who didn't waste a single word when 10 unnecessary ones could be cut away. In front of her was an open laptop displaying the file access history from the storage system used by the law office that handled the Callahan organization. Elara sat in the corner of the room, her chair pulled back from the table, no document in front of her, no pencil in her hand. She hadn't been asked to speak. She had been asked to be here. She understood the difference clearly. Garrett Flynn walked into the room at 3:15. Different suit from yesterday, black instead of gray, as if he knew today required him to look more serious. The smile was gone from his face, but the calm remained, the kind of calm that had become bone-deep, needing no effort to maintain. He looked at Petra, looked at the 2 versions of the document on the desk, looked at Elara in the corner, then pulled out the chair across from Rhys and sat down. Petra began. Her voice was flat, without emotion, reading facts the way someone reads a quarterly financial report. The file access history shows that the renewal contract document was opened, edited, and saved on October 12th through an account registered under the name Meridian Linguistic Services, a translation company hired 7 weeks ago to replace the previous translation firm that the Callahan organization had used for 9 years. Reason for replacement listed in the internal email. Scheduling conflict. She paused and turned a page on the laptop. Meridian Linguistic Services was registered in Delaware 6 months ago. It has no other clients besides the Callahan organization. No website, no reviews. The registered address is a monthly rented virtual office in Wilmington. The person who signed the contract to hire Meridian Linguistic Services for the Callahan organization was Garrett Flynn. She closed the laptop. That is everything the access history shows. The room fell silent. Garrett sat across from Rhys, both hands resting on the table, not folded, not clenched, simply resting there. He didn't deny it, didn't admit it, didn't explain, didn't open his mouth. Silence. And that kind of silence, in that room, with the 2 versions of the document lying between them and 3 people looking at him, was a clearer answer than any confession could have been. Rhys spoke. His voice was quiet, quieter than Elara had ever heard it, quieter even than when he had spoken about his father the night before, quieter even than when he had asked her on the phone 2 mornings ago if she could come back. And she had learned, in the few short days she had known this man, that when Rhys Callahan's voice grew quiet, everything around him should be afraid. "My father took you in off the street when you were 14. His voice remained low and even. "You ate at my family's table. You wore my old clothes. You held a gun beside me the night he died. 22 years. Rhys's hand tightened around the arm of the leather chair. His knuckles drained white. His jaw was so hard that Elara could see the line of tendon standing beneath the skin from where she sat in the corner of the room. And you did this. The last 4 words came out even quieter than the ones before them. So quiet that if the room hadn't been completely silent, no one would have heard them. But the room was completely silent. Silent for 5 seconds. 5 seconds in which no one breathed loudly enough to be heard. Garrett swallowed. It was the only movement in his body during those 5 seconds, and it revealed more than he wanted it to. For the first time in 22 years, Garrett Flynn's face couldn't find the right expression for the moment. Not false calm, not strategic remorse, not defensive outrage. Empty, like a screen that had lost its signal. The dissolution meeting lasted less than 2 hours. Petra read the clauses. Rhys signed. Garrett didn't sign because his signature wasn't needed. The decision was unilateral. No scandal, no police, no press. Rhys chose the cleanest surgical path. Civil litigation running in parallel with Volkov's internal audit. A double clamp from 2 directions. Not loud, but with no way out. Garrett lost everything he had wanted to steal, and everything he had already had. Access revoked, accounts frozen. His name removed from every organizational record before he could make it out of the building. When Garrett stood and walked out of the room, he passed where Elara sat in the corner. He stopped, didn't turn fully. Only stopped and tilted his head just enough for his eyes to meet hers. This time, there was no smile, no soft threat like "careful what you hear." The look he gave her was something she hadn't expected. Not anger, not contempt, but acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that he had been defeated by the person he had dismissed completely, the person he had called temporary cleaning staff, the person he had fired with an after-hours phone call, the person he had sentenced with the 3 words she heard too much. He looked at her for 3 seconds. Then he walked away. The door closed. The elevator opened and shut one last time. 3 days later, Elara was kneeling on the wooden floor of an apartment in Dorchester, wiping down the leg of a dining table with a damp cloth, one earbud in her ear playing an advanced Italian lesson on the remote past tense in literature. All Clean Services had assigned her to a new client the day after she was pulled from the Seaport District penthouse, with no further explanation, no apology, only a short message with the new address and start time. She arrived on time, worked without complaint, and left without a trace except the smell of clean, exactly like every day, before she walked into Rhys Callahan's penthouse, and her life turned in a direction she still hadn't had time to name. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. She pulled out the left earbud and looked at the screen. Unknown number. Boston area code. She answered. Hello. The voice on the other end she recognized in less than a second. Low, spare, each word heavier than ordinary words. Rhys Callahan didn't ask how she was, didn't begin with pleasantries, didn't ask whether she was doing well or what she was doing. He went straight to the point the way he did everything, with no circling because circling wasted time and time was something he had learned not to waste. I have a new position in the organization, he said. International Communications Advisor, responsible for all communication with Volkov and other international partners, reviewing every document before I sign anything. Salary 5 times what you're making at All Clean, full health insurance, and a budget for formal education if you want it. He said all of it in one unbroken flow, without pausing in the middle to wait for a reaction, without leaning on the salary or the insurance the way a salesman would try to make an impression. He laid out the facts, completely, then went silent and waited. Elara listened to everything without interrupting. When he stopped, the silence on the line stretched for 3 seconds. Then she said, Can I give you my answer tomorrow? Yes, he said. He didn't ask why. He didn't sound surprised. Just yes, and then he hung up. Elara put the earbud back in, returned to the Italian lesson, and kept wiping the table leg. She didn't ask for time out of pride, not because she wanted to seem difficult or create some fake negotiating position. She asked for time because she had learned, in the hardest and longest way possible, that when the thing you have wanted most finally appears, your first instinct is to grab it before it disappears, and that instinct, however natural, however understandable, is the most expensive instinct there is, because accepting too quickly the thing you have always wanted means giving up the right to negotiate for what you deserve. and she had given up too many things in her life to know that this time she wouldn't give up one more. That night, in the studio apartment in Dorchester, she sat on the kitchen floor, the same place where she had sat when she finally translated her mother's last sentence, the same place where she had cried for the last time in her life, her back against the refrigerator, her legs stretched across the cold tile, a blank sheet of paper on her lap, a ballpoint pen in her hand. She wrote. Not long, not ornate. A list. Item 1. A flexible work schedule that would allow her to arrange time for study. Item 2. The opportunity for formal education, specifically a bachelor's program in linguistics or international relations at a university in Boston, with tuition paid by the organization. Item 3. A clear employment contract, written in both English and Russian, because she understood better than anyone that the language in a contract decides everything, and she would never again sign something she couldn't read all the way through with her own eyes. Item 4. A clause she drafted herself, written more carefully than the first 3 items combined. The right to refuse to translate, interpret, or convey any content that she, based on her own personal judgment, believed violated her personal ethics. No explanation required, no punishment for refusing. That clause wasn't in any employment contract she had ever seen, because no one had ever needed it. But she did, because she was about to step into a world where the line between legal and illegal was as thin as a strand of hair, and she needed a rope she tied for herself so she would know when to stop. She knew this was a mafia organization. She wasn't naive. She had known from the moment she saw the gun beneath Rhys's suit jacket on the first day. But she also knew that in every system, even an underground one, there was always room for the person who set clear limits and kept them. She finished writing the 4 items, read them over once, folded the paper in half, and slipped it into a blue folder she had bought at CVS on the walk home for $2.99. She set the folder on the small kitchen table beside the sink, next to the salt jar and the cheap box of tea. Then she turned off the light, lay down on the bed, and for the first time in many nights, fell asleep before 12 o'clock. The next morning, Elara took the first Silver Line train from Dorchester back to the Seaport District. The blue CVS folder was tucked under her right arm, her backpack over her left shoulder, her earphones in her coat pocket. But today she didn't put them in. Today, she wanted to hear the city. The sound of Boston at 7 o'clock on a November morning, the horn of a ship out in the harbor, the wind off the water moving through the narrow streets of the seaport, the sound of her shoes striking the sidewalk as she walked the final 4 blocks to the building where the penthouse sat, the same building she had entered for the first time a week earlier, carrying a mop bucket and a cleaning uniform. She stopped in front of the building and looked up. The top 3 floors, mirrored glass, balconies overlooking the whole of Boston Harbor. Then she looked down at the side service entrance she had used every previous time, the narrow door along the side of the building, the kind of door designed for the people who passed through it not to be seen. She walked toward the main entrance. The intercom buzzed inside the security room before she even had time to press the bell. Rhys had told them she was coming. Ray Whitmore sat in the security room with the camera monitors in front of him and a cup of coffee to his right, just as he had every morning for as many years as he had sat in that chair. But this morning, when he saw Elara on the screen, Ray did something he had never done before. He stood up, pushed his chair back, walked out of the security room, down the short hallway, and to the main entrance of the building, the heavy double-glass doors that only invited guests and members of the organization used. He opened the door by hand. Not with the remote button in the security room. By hand. He stood there holding the heavy glass with his right hand, while his left gave the slightest nod toward the lobby inside. The kind of gesture reserved for people he had been told to treat with respect. Elara stepped through the main entrance for the first time. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She didn't say thank you because this wasn't a favor. It was a change. And a change doesn't require thanks. It requires acknowledgement by continuing to walk forward. So she walked. Through the main marble lobby she had never seen before, because every other time she had come through the side entrance, past the main elevator with mirrors and warm lighting instead of the stainless steel service elevator used by employees. Up to the penthouse, the doors opening into the living room from the same direction Rhys Callahan himself entered every day. Rhys was waiting in the kitchen, standing beside the granite island, a cup of coffee in his hand. But today, it wasn't coffee she had made. He had made it himself, and that small detail told her that something had shifted in the way he understood the distance between them. She placed the blue folder on the granite counter between his coffee cup and a stack of unopened mail. He set his cup down, opened the folder, and pulled out the sheet of paper. 4 handwritten items, clear, orderly, black ink on white paper. He read from item 1 through item 4. He paused longer at item 4 than at the other 3 combined. The right to refuse to translate content that violated her personal ethics, with no explanation required and no punishment for refusing. He read that item twice. Then he looked up at her. The corner of his mouth moved slightly. Not a smile, but the closest thing to a smile she had seen from him, closer even than the one in the study when she had told him she needed a quiet desk and no one standing behind her. "You negotiate better than most people in my world," he said. "I learn fast," she said. She didn't smile, but something in her eyes changed. Light, almost invisible, like the surface of a lake just after the wind has stopped. She turned toward the window. Boston Harbor stretched below them, the pale morning light of November slanting through the glass, drawing a long line across the wooden floor and over half her face. She looked out at the harbor, at the small boats moving slowly across the silver-gray water, at the skyline she had only seen a few days earlier from the sidewalk 4 floors below. Rhys stood 2 steps away from her. Not closer. Not farther. Exactly the right distance for 2 people who had only just begun to trust each other in a world where trust could get you killed. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything, but that silence wasn't heavy like the silences before. It wasn't tense. It wasn't full of questions that hadn't yet been asked. It was light. Light in the way only 2 people who have lost in similar ways can create when they stand beside each other without needing to explain why. Then Elara turned back to the table, sat down, opened the next document that needed to be reviewed, the first document of her new role, the first page of the next chapter. Rhys pulled out a chair and sat across from her, and for the first time, he didn't sit at the head of the table. He sat level with her. The quiet sound of paper turning moved through the still room, morning light flooding through the glass. 2 people from completely different worlds sitting across from each other at the same table, and that sound of paper turning felt like the sound of something beginning. The story of Elara Voss and Rhys Callahan isn't a fairy tale. There is no magic in it, no one saved by luck. There is only a girl who grew up without a father or a mother, passed through 6 foster families, carried a scar on her wrist she never spoke about, taught herself 11 languages through a phone and a pair of earphones, scrubbed floors, wiped tables, cleaned glass, and never, not once, stopped learning. Not because she believed that one day it would all be rewarded, but because she didn't know any other way to live. And that is the lesson this story wants to leave behind. That the true value of a person doesn't lie in a degree, doesn't lie in where they came from, doesn't lie in what other people think of them when they see them in a cleaning uniform or in a 3-piece suit. Value lies in what you build quietly, when no one is watching, in the knowledge you gather for yourself when no one believes you need it, in the patience you manage to keep when the world tells you that you should give up, in the dignity you never lose even when circumstance takes everything else away. No one handed Elara an opportunity. She created opportunity by becoming the kind of person who was already ready when opportunity finally arrived. And if this story has reached you, if it has made you think of something in your own life, of the times you were underestimated, of the moments you wanted to quit, of the times you wondered whether anyone could even see what you were doing, then please press the like button for this video. Share it with someone you think needs to hear this story today. And if you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, please subscribe so you don't miss stories like this every day. We would truly love to hear your thoughts. What did this story make you think about in real life? Have you ever been in a situation where no one believed you could do it, but you did it anyway? Share it with us in the comments, because every story you carry, no matter how small it may seem, deserves to be heard, and we want to hear it from the deepest place in your heart. We wish everyone watching this video strong health, a joyful life, peaceful days, and energy that carries you forward. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.